There is a strange moment in every love story. The moment when happiness begins to feel fragile. Not because anything terrible has happened yet, but because something inside you quietly senses that change is coming. For Daniel and me, that moment arrived on an ordinary afternoon. An afternoon that started like any other, but ended in a way that would change everything. It was a Tuesday evening when Daniel called me. His voice sounded tired. Not just physically tired, but emotionally drained. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," I replied. "You okay?" There was a pause on the phone, longer than usual. "Yeah," he finally said. "I just had a long day." Something about his tone made my chest tighten. "Do you want me to come over?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. Then he said something strange. "Actually, I was hoping we could meet somewhere." "Somewhere?" "Yeah, just somewhere quiet." That was unusual. Daniel normally preferred staying in when he felt tired, but this time he wanted to go out. "Okay," I said. "Where?" He mentioned a small park not far from the city center, a place we had visited once before. When I arrived at the park, Daniel was already sitting on a wooden bench near the lake. The sun was beginning to set. Orange light reflected across the water. But Daniel didn't seem to notice the view. He was staring at the ground, lost in thought. I walked toward him slowly. "Daniel?" He looked up and forced a small smile. "Hey." I sat beside him. For a moment, we both stayed silent. Then I noticed something that immediately worried me. Daniel looked thinner, not dramatically, but enough that I could see it in his face. "Daniel," I said gently, "what's going on?" He sighed deeply. "I was hoping you wouldn't ask that right away." "Why?" "Because I'm not sure how to say it." My heart began beating faster. "Say what?" Daniel rubbed his hands together nervously. Then he spoke quietly. "Do you remember when you told me I should see a doctor?" "Yes." I finally did. The words felt heavy in the air. "And?" I asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Medical documents. He handed them to me. My hands felt cold as I opened them. I scanned the page quickly. At first, I didn't understand what I was reading. But then, one word stood out, and suddenly the world felt like it had stopped moving. I looked up at Daniel slowly. My voice trembled. "Daniel." "What is this?" Daniel looked at me quietly, his eyes filled with sadness. "It's the result from the hospital tests." My chest tightened. "Tests for what?" Daniel took a slow breath. "For the coughing." The silence that followed felt unbearable. I looked back down at the paper. The medical terms were confusing, but one word appeared again and again. A word I never expected to see connected to someone I loved. Cancer. My hands started shaking. This can't be right. Daniel looked away toward the lake. "The doctors found something in my lungs." I could barely breathe. "What do you mean, something?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said the words that shattered the quiet evening. "It's lung cancer." The moment everything fell apart. The world suddenly felt unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's nightmare. "You're joking," I said quickly. "This has to be a mistake." Daniel shook his head slowly. "They ran the tests twice." The words felt like knives. "No," I whispered. "This doesn't make sense. You're healthy. You're young. This kind of thing doesn't just happen." Daniel's voice became soft. I said the same thing. I stared at him in disbelief. "How long have you known?" Daniel hesitated. "A few weeks." My heart dropped. "A few weeks? You knew this for weeks and you didn't tell me?" His eyes filled with guilt. "I didn't want to scare you." "Daniel!" I said, my voice breaking. "You should have told me." "I know," he said quietly. I just needed time to understand it myself. Tears began forming in my eyes. Is it treatable? Daniel looked down at his hands. The doctors say it's serious. My chest tightened painfully, but they also said treatment could help slow it down. Slow it down. Those words echoed in my mind. Not cure it, slow it down. But Daniel wasn't finished speaking, and what he said next shocked me even more. There's something else, he said. My heart sank. What? Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. I almost didn't go to the doctor. I stared at him. What do you mean? I ignored the symptoms for months. Months? I repeated. Daniel nodded slowly. I thought it was just stress or allergies. My voice trembled. Daniel, why didn't you check earlier? He looked at me with sadness. Because I didn't want anything to interrupt the life we were building. Those words hit me harder than the diagnosis itself. He had been protecting our happiness, even while his own body was warning him something was wrong. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The sun slowly disappeared behind the horizon. The park lights flickered on one by one. But none of it mattered anymore, because everything about our future had suddenly become uncertain. Finally, I reached for Daniel's hand. Look at me, I said softly. He did. We're going to fight this, I told him, together. Daniel looked at me carefully. You didn't sign up for this, he said quietly. I squeezed his hand tighter. Yes, I replied. I did. That night was the moment our story changed forever. The adventures didn't disappear, the love didn't fade, but everything became more serious, more fragile, more urgent, because suddenly, time mattered in a way it never had before, and neither of us knew how much time we truly had left. But one thing became clear that night in the park. No matter what happened next, I wasn't leaving Daniel's side. Not now, not ever. After the night Daniel told me the truth, life didn't slow down. It changed. Suddenly, every day felt more important. Every moment together felt more valuable. And every conversation carried a weight we had never felt before. Because now we were no longer just building a future, we were fighting to protect it. The first time I walked into the hospital with Daniel, I tried to stay calm. Hospitals have a strange atmosphere. Everything is clean. Everything is organized. But behind every hallway and every door, there are stories of people fighting battles no one else can see. Daniel sat beside me in the waiting room. His hands rested quietly on his knees, but I could see the tension in his fingers. You okay? I asked softly. He nodded. Yeah. But the truth was obvious. Daniel was scared, and honestly, so was I. When the nurse finally called his name, Daniel stood up slowly. Then he looked back at me. You don't have to come in, he said. I stood up immediately. Yes, I do. And together, we walked into the room where our lives were about to change again. The doctor spoke calmly, professionally, but every word felt heavy. Daniel would need treatment. There would be chemotherapy. There would be difficult days. Days when his body would feel weak. Days when hope might feel fragile. But there was still a chance to slow the disease, a chance to buy time. When we left the hospital, neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Daniel said something quietly. I'm sorry. I turned to him. For what? For dragging you into this. I stopped walking. Daniel, I said firmly, you didn't drag me into anything. Then I took his hand. I chose to be here. The next few months became the hardest period of our lives. Treatment began. Hospital visits became part of our routine. Some days Daniel felt strong, almost normal. On those days, we tried to live like nothing had changed. We went out for dinner, watched movies, took late-night drives just to clear our minds. But other days were much harder. The treatments made Daniel weak. Sometimes he barely had the energy to get out of bed. There were mornings when I found him sitting quietly by the window, staring outside with tired eyes. "What are you thinking about?" I would ask. Daniel usually smiled, just appreciating the view. But I knew he was thinking about something deeper, something heavier, something neither of us wanted to say out loud. One evening, after a particularly difficult treatment session, Daniel sat quietly in his apartment. The room was dim. Rain tapped softly against the windows. I brought him a glass of water and sat beside him. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then suddenly he said something that broke my heart. "What if this doesn't work?" I turned toward him. "It will." "But what if it doesn't?" he repeated. His voice sounded tired, not just physically tired, but emotionally exhausted. "I hate seeing you go through this," he continued. "You deserve a normal life." I felt tears forming in my eyes. "Daniel," I said gently, "my life is with you. But what if I can't give you the future you deserve?" I looked directly at him. "You already have." For a moment, Daniel didn't respond. Then he pulled me into a quiet embrace. And in that moment, we both understood something. Love isn't measured by how long it lasts. Sometimes it's measured by how deeply people choose to stand by each other when life becomes difficult. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Daniel had one of his better days. He woke up with more energy than usual. When I arrived at his apartment, he was already dressed. "Where are we going?" I asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "You'll see." We drove to a quiet hill outside the city, the same hill where he had once given me the compass necklace. The sunset painted the sky with deep golden colors. For a moment, we simply stood there, watching the horizon. Then Daniel reached into his pocket. My heart immediately began racing. "Daniel?" He opened a small velvet box. This time, it really was a ring. Daniel took a slow breath. "I know this might not make sense," he said softly. "Right now, my life is complicated, uncertain. But there's one thing I am absolutely certain about." He looked directly into my eyes. "You." My vision blurred with tears. Daniel continued. "I don't know how much time I have, but whatever time it is, I want to spend it as your husband." He knelt slowly in front of me. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. My heart was overwhelmed with emotions. Love, fear, hope, pain. But one thing was clear. I didn't need time to think. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, Daniel." We didn't plan a huge wedding, just something small, something meaningful. Family, close friends, a simple ceremony. And for the first time in months, hope returned. Daniel seemed happier, more motivated. We talked about the future again, about places we wanted to visit, about the kind of life we wanted to build together. And for a brief moment, it felt like we had beaten the darkness. But life has a way of testing people when they least expect it. And just when we believed things might finally be turning around, everything began to change again. One night, about 3 weeks before the wedding, my phone rang. It was the hospital. Daniel had been admitted unexpectedly. His condition had worsened. By the time I reached the hospital, the doctors were already waiting outside his room. And the expressions on their faces told me something I didn't want to believe. Something terrible had happened. When the hospital called me that night, my heart immediately dropped. There are certain phone calls in life that people never forget. Calls that change everything. This was one of them. I don't remember how fast I drove. I don't remember how many red lights I passed. All I remember is the feeling in my chest. That quiet, sinking feeling that something was very wrong. When I finally reached the hospital, the building looked the same as always. Bright lights, quiet hallways, people moving quickly between rooms. But somehow it felt different this time. Heavier. As I walked toward the front desk, a nurse recognized me immediately. "Are you here for Daniel?" she asked gently. I nodded. She didn't say much after that. She simply asked me to follow her. And as we walked down the long hallway toward his room, I began preparing myself for something I didn't want to accept. 2 doctors were waiting outside Daniel's room. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Doctors rarely wait outside rooms unless something serious has happened. One of them stepped forward. His voice was calm, professional, but careful. "Daniel had a complication earlier tonight," he explained. "The treatments have been very hard on his body." I swallowed slowly. "Is he okay?" I asked. The doctor paused, and in that pause, my heart already knew the answer. "He's stable for now," he said, "but his condition has progressed faster than we expected." Those words felt like the ground shifting beneath my feet. Progressed faster. A polite way of saying something none of us wanted to hear. "How much time?" I asked quietly. The doctor hesitated again. "It's difficult to say exactly, but we believe Daniel would benefit from having the people he loves close to him right now." That was the moment the truth settled in my chest. This wasn't just another hospital visit. This was goodbye approaching. When I finally walked into his room, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Machines hummed softly. A heart monitor blinked with slow, steady rhythm. Daniel lay in the hospital bed, his eyes closed. For a moment, I stood by the door, afraid to move, afraid that if I got closer, the reality would become too real. But then Daniel's eyes opened, and when he saw me, he smiled. Even after everything, even after months of treatments, he still smiled the same way he always had. "Hey," he said softly. I walked quickly to his side and took his hand. "Hey," I replied. His hand felt weaker than before, but it still held mine the same way. Warm, familiar, home. For a few minutes, we didn't talk about anything serious. We talked about the weather, about the wedding plans, about how terrible hospital food always is. It was almost funny. 2 people pretending life was still normal. But eventually, Daniel looked at me with a quiet understanding. "I talked to the doctor," he said. My chest tightened. "And?" He took a slow breath. "I think my body is getting tired." Hearing him say it out loud felt like a knife twisting in my heart. "Don't say that," I whispered. But Daniel shook his head gently. "It's okay." Then he squeezed my hand softly. "You remember the night we first met?" I nodded. How could I forget? Daniel smiled faintly. "That was the best accident of my life." Tears began forming in my eyes. "I thought the same thing," I admitted. After a few minutes, Daniel reached slowly toward the small table beside his bed. There was a small box sitting there, the same velvet box from the proposal. He handed it to me. "I want you to keep this," he said. "I already am keeping it," I replied. Daniel smiled. "No, I mean forever." My throat tightened. "Daniel." He shook his head gently. "Listen to me." I stayed quiet. "Marrying you was the easiest decision I ever made," he continued. "And even if life didn't give us the years we planned, I would still choose you again. I would still choose you to promise me something." "What?" Daniel looked directly into my eyes. "Promise me you won't stop living." My voice trembled. "How am I supposed to do that without you?" Daniel smiled softly. "The same way you walked into my life. Bravely." The night grew quieter. The machines beside the bed continued their soft rhythm. Daniel's breathing became slower, more peaceful. I sat beside him, holding his hand, not wanting to let go. At one point, he looked at me again. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You made my life beautiful." I leaned closer. "You made mine too." He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he whispered one last sentence. "I love you." The words hung gently in the air, and a few minutes later, the room became completely still. The machine beside the bed let out a long, quiet tone. And just like that, Daniel's fight was over. Months passed. Life slowly continued moving forward. But some things never truly leave you. Some people remain part of you forever. One evening, I returned to the hill where Daniel had proposed. The same hill, the same horizon, the same golden sunset. I stood there quietly, holding the compass necklace he had given me long ago. The wind moved gently through the grass, and for a moment, it felt like Daniel was still there, standing beside me, smiling the way he always did. Love stories don't always end the way people expect. Sometimes they end too soon, but that doesn't make them any less meaningful. Because love isn't measured by time, it's measured by moments, and Daniel gave me a lifetime of moments in the short time we had together. I looked out at the horizon one last time, then whispered softly into the wind, "Thank you for choosing me."